With a population of over 128 million, you would assume that the streets of Mexico are packed to the brim with people, but only around 18% of the land is actually occupied. Why is that? For the last century, the majority of the Mexican population has remained packed densely into just a tiny portion of the land that runs along the center of the country. Around 66 million people live in this area, with over 20 million of that number living within the heart of this strip, which we know as Mexico City. But with almost 2 million square kilometers of land, why is everyone choosing to live within such a small area rather than spreading out? The answer, as you might have already guessed, is the weather. Similar to Australia, the Mexican weather conditions within the northern and southern areas have created several complications for everyday standards of living. The north of the country has extremely high temperatures, acting as a desert biome that makes the sustainability of agriculture incredibly difficult. In the south, it's the complete opposite. This land is occupied by rainforest or jungle biomes, which, as you can expect, make it a complete struggle to build out a livable city or community. These sorts of climates are huge obstacles for the building of infrastructure, as the heavy rain results in a lack of ability for materials like concrete to dry and maintain its structure when it's being newly built. Unlike the northern biomes, the weather conditions in the south are also barriers to agricultural development. Heavy rain can make it difficult for crops to continuously grow due to being overwatered. And not to mention, there are some problems with the biome's natural terrain too. In rainforests, there is an abundance of fungi and bacteria, which makes it near impossible for nutrients to actually make their way into the soil. Because of this, any sort of agriculture in this biome would require extensive capital spent on fertilizers. But even then, the wide range of fungi and bacteria will likely just attack any crops that are growing on its lands, which would mean an even bigger investment into tools like pesticides, which, overall, would make the return on this sort of agriculture very low. And outside of just desert and rainforest, there's also another type of land in this country: mountains. With around 70% of Mexico being covered in mountains, it makes it much more difficult to develop more city centers and community hubs due to the difficulty of establishing infrastructure on this type of terrain. The raised ground and the lack of flat surfaces would require highly expensive and labor-intensive projects, which may not be ideal for the Mexican government's budget. Mexico cities have to be strategically placed in areas of flat valleys in between or on smaller mountains. That's because the surrounding mountains are able to help lower the temperatures into a cooler, more temperate climate that is much more suitable for not just agriculture, but also living. This also assists with the construction projects, as this ideal temperature doesn't require any other extensive planning or capital investment into building infrastructure. Since the temperature is in an ideal range, there's no worries of excessive rainfall or heat like in the other biomes, which is why this is where the central strip of Mexico is. And in the cases of the rainforest, desert, and other mountainous areas that we've talked about, the terrain also just doesn't allow for arable soil. A majority of the arable soil actually exists within that central strip of land where most of the Mexican population already lives. And that's because that area of the country is surrounded by volcanoes and mountains that help to regulate the temperatures for fertile soil and create natural fertilizers through ash. Now, with so much difficult terrain all across the country, it's obvious that the transportation can get a bit cumbersome if you're not living within the flatter lands or the valleys. Transportation in Mexico often requires zigzagging around mountains or up mountains to get from point A to point B. With most of the populated city centers having to be restricted to valleys, that means that traveling between destinations can be quite tedious and difficult at times. Building transportation between cities is extremely costly, as you have to literally build through mountains to create a path to connect one valley to another. There's also a lack of travelable bodies of water, meaning that there is no alternative to building out mountain roads for transportation. This results in heavy amounts of capital to be invested, leaving little room to create more city hubs in other biomes, which, as we've mentioned, are highly costly.